In the summer of 1862, beneath the suffocating heat of rural Alabama, a woman named Hattie set fire to the main house of Thornwood Plantation, burning alive Colonel Richard Thornwood and his 3 legitimate sons as they slept. The flames consumed not only the bodies of the master and his heirs, but also the illusion of order that the plantation aristocracy had so carefully constructed. This is not a tale of justice, for there was no justice to be found in that world. This is a story of how enslavement twisted human beings into instruments of their own damnation, and how one woman, pushed beyond the boundaries of endurance, became both victim and executioner in a system designed to destroy the soul. You are watching Shadows of the South, where we unearth the most disturbing and forgotten stories of the slave-holding South. These are not comfortable histories. They are the stories that were buried in unmarked graves, whispered in parlors, and erased from family Bibles. But they demand to be remembered, for they reveal the true cost of a society built on human bondage. Thornwood Plantation sat on nearly 2,000 acres in the Black Belt region of central Alabama, where the soil was dark and rich, perfect for cotton. Colonel Richard Thornwood had inherited the land from his father in 1845, and by 1860, he owned 217 enslaved people. The main house was a columned monument to wealth, painted white and surrounded by magnolia trees that perfumed the air with their heavy, sweet scent. Inside, crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings painted with pastoral scenes, and imported furniture from France filled rooms that few would ever see. This was the temple of Southern prosperity, and Richard Thornwood was its high priest. The colonel was 47 years old in 1862, a man of education and refinement, who had studied law at the University of Virginia before returning to manage his inheritance. He wore his hair pomaded and parted severely, and he dressed in black suits even in the Alabama heat, as if perpetually attending a funeral. He spoke softly with the measured cadence of a man accustomed to obedience, and he quoted scripture with the same ease that he quoted plantation yields. His neighbors considered him a model master, firm but fair, a man who understood his Christian duty to provide for those under his care. He attended services every Sunday at Bethel Baptist Church, where he sat in the front pew with his wife Martha and their 3 sons, Richard Jr., aged 22, Thomas, aged 19, and William, aged 16. Martha Thornwood was a woman of delicate constitution, pale and thin, who spent much of her time in her chambers, suffering from what the family physician called nervous exhaustion. She had been raised in Charleston society, the daughter of a rice planter, and she had never fully adjusted to the isolation of rural Alabama. She played the pianoforte with skill, embroidered pillowcases with scriptural verses, and supervised the household servants with a distracted air, as if she were always listening for some distant sound that never came. By 1860, she had largely withdrawn from the management of the plantation, leaving such matters to her husband and eldest son. It was into this world that Hattie had been born in 1838, in a cabin behind the cotton gin, the daughter of a woman named Dinah, who worked in the plantation hospital. Hattie's father was unknown, or rather, unacknowledged, though everyone on the plantation understood that she carried the blood of the Thornwood family in her veins. Her skin was lighter than most of the other enslaved people, a golden brown that caught the sunlight, and her features were fine and symmetrical. As a child, she had worked in the main house, first carrying water and polishing silver, then learning to sew and dress hair. By the time she was 14, she had become Martha Thornwood's personal maid, sleeping on a pallet in the dressing room, always within calling distance. The colonel had first come to her when she was 15 years old. On a night in late September when the air was still and hot, he had knocked softly on the door of her cabin, hat in hand, speaking in that same soft voice he used to quote scripture. He told her that she was fortunate, that he had chosen her for a special role, that she would be cared for as long as she remained obedient and discreet. Hattie had not spoken. There were no words available to her in that moment, no language that could have changed what was about to happen. She knew what other women on the plantation had endured. She knew that resistance meant the whipping post, or sail away from her mother, or worse. And so she had learned to disappear inside herself, to become a witness to her own life, rather than a participant in it. Over the next 9 years, Hattie bore 4 children to Colonel Thornwood. The first, a girl named Sarah, was born in 1854 and died of fever before her second birthday. The second, a boy named Daniel, was born in 1856 and was sold to a trader from Mobile when he was 4 years old, after Martha Thornwood complained that his presence in the house disturbed her nerves. The third, another boy named James, was born in 1858 and still lived on the plantation, working in the stables under the supervision of the overseer. The fourth, a girl named Louisa, was born in 1861, just as the war began, and she slept in a wooden box beside Hattie's bed in the cabin she had been given behind the kitchen house. Pause for a moment and reflect. In a world where even one's own children could be sold like livestock, where the most intimate human connections were treated as property transactions, what remained of the soul? How does a mother survive the knowledge that her love itself is a form of theft, subject to confiscation at any moment? The war had changed everything and nothing at Thornwood Plantation. Richard Jr. had joined the Confederate cavalry in the spring of 1861, full of romantic notions about honor and glory, but he had returned home within 6 months with a shattered leg that refused to heal properly. He now walked with a cane and spent his days drinking whiskey on the veranda, staring out at the cotton fields with hollow eyes. Thomas had been sent to study at the military academy in Montgomery, but the academy had closed, and he had come home as well, angry and restless, taking out his frustrations on the enslaved workers, with increasingly brutal punishments. William, the youngest, was still too young for military service, but he spoke constantly of joining up, of proving himself in battle, even as his mother wept and begged him to wait. The plantation itself was struggling. With so many men gone to war, there were not enough hands to work the cotton, and the fields that had once been pristine were now overgrown with weeds. The overseer, a man named Hackett, who had been hired from Georgia, was vicious and unpredictable, using the whip with enthusiasm and administering punishments that left men unable to work for days. Food was scarce. The Union blockade had cut off imports, and the plantation had to produce everything it needed. Rations were reduced, first for the enslaved population, then for everyone. By the summer of 1862, even the main house was running low on flour and coffee, and Martha Thornwood's nerves had deteriorated to the point that she rarely left her room. It was in this atmosphere of decay and desperation that the event occurred, which would set Hattie on her path toward that summer night of fire. On the evening of June 15, 1862, the colonel summoned Hattie to the library. This was not unusual. He often called for her in the evenings, after Martha had retired, and Hattie would come to him through the back stairs, moving like a ghost through the darkened house. But on this night, something was different. The colonel was not alone. Richard Jr. was with him, seated in a leather chair by the window, his injured leg stretched out before him, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The colonel explained, in that same soft voice, that his eldest son had expressed a desire for companionship, that it was natural for a young man to have certain needs, particularly in these difficult times, that Hattie would fulfill this role for Richard Jr., just as she had for the colonel himself, that this was simply an extension of her duties, and that she would be compensated with better rations and a new dress for Louisa. Richard Jr. said nothing during this speech. He simply stared at Hattie with eyes that held neither desire nor compassion, only a kind of dull entitlement, as if she were a piece of furniture being moved from one room to another. Hattie had stood there in the lamplight, feeling something crack open inside her chest, some final barrier between endurance and annihilation. For 9 years, she had survived by telling herself that she was protecting her children, that compliance meant safety, that she could endure anything as long as they were allowed to live. But Daniel had been sold anyway, Sarah had died anyway, and now she understood, with a clarity that felt like drowning, that there was no amount of obedience that would ever be enough, no depth of degradation that would purchase safety for James or Louisa. The system would take everything, always, and call it mercy. She had bowed her head and murmured, "Yes, master, because those were the only words that kept you alive. But something had changed, something had broken that could not be repaired. The arrangement continued through June and into July. Richard Jr. would send for her, usually late at night, and she would go to his room in the east wing of the house. He never spoke to her, except to give instructions. Afterward, he would turn his back and fall asleep immediately, snoring softly, while Hattie would lie awake in the darkness, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the house settling around her. Sometimes she could hear Martha Thornwood weeping in her distant chamber. Sometimes she could hear Thomas pacing in his room, his boots heavy on the floorboards. The house was full of ghosts, and they were all still living. During the day, Hattie moved through her duties with mechanical precision. She dressed Martha's hair, served breakfast to the family, supervised the younger house servants, and returned to her cabin each afternoon to nurse Louisa and check on James. The other enslaved people watched her with a mixture of pity and resentment. They knew what was happening. Everyone always knew, but no one spoke of it directly, because speaking of such things could get you killed. There was a woman named Betsy who worked in the kitchen, a woman in her 50s, who had survived longer than most by learning to read the moods of white people before they even recognized those moods themselves. She would sometimes leave extra cornbread in Hattie's cabin, or slip a piece of salt pork into her apron. These small acts of kindness were the only language of solidarity available to them. There was a man named Moses, who worked as the plantation blacksmith, a massive man with arms like tree trunks, who had been at Thornwood since he was a boy. He had taught James how to handle the horses, and sometimes, when no one was watching, he would carve small wooden toys for Louisa. He said little, but his eyes were watchful, and Hattie sometimes felt that he understood more than he revealed. There was a young woman named Clara, barely 20, who worked in the fields and sang hymns while she picked cotton, her voice rising clear and strong above the other workers. She had a way of looking at the white people that suggested she saw through them, saw the rot beneath the refinement, and she would not lower her eyes unless forced. If you're finding value in these forgotten histories, consider subscribing to Shadows of the South. These stories need to be told, and your support allows us to continue bringing them to light. The past speaks to us, if only we're willing to listen. The incident that precipitated the final tragedy occurred on the night of July 28, a Sunday. The family had attended services at Bethel Baptist Church that morning, where Reverend Clayton had preached a sermon about the righteousness of Southern civilization and the divine sanction of slavery. He had quoted Ephesians, as he always did, "Servants, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in singleness of your heart, as unto Christ." The congregation had nodded along, fanning themselves in the heat, secure in the knowledge that God Himself had ordained their way of life. That evening, after supper, the colonel had gathered his sons in the library to discuss the plantation's finances. The cotton crop was failing. The overseer was demanding more money. Creditors in Mobile were making threats. The war was not going as everyone had promised it would, and there were rumors that Union forces were pushing deeper into the South. Richard Jr. argued that they should sell some of the enslaved workers to raise capital. Thomas suggested that they increase the workload and reduce rations further. William, eager to contribute, proposed that they hire out some of the men to other plantations for additional income. The colonel had listened to all of this and then announced his decision. They would sell James, Hattie's son, to a labor contractor who was buying young men for work on the Mobile fortifications. The boy was 13 years old, strong and healthy, and he would fetch a good price. The sale would take place within the week. Hattie learned of this decision from Betsy, who had overheard it while serving the men their brandy. She found Hattie in her cabin that night, sitting on the edge of her bed with Louisa asleep beside her, and she delivered the news in a whisper, her old hands trembling. Hattie had not cried. She had simply nodded, thanked Betsy, and then sat in the darkness for a long time, listening to her daughter breathe. In that moment, something clarified inside her. the way water clarifies when the sediment finally settles. She understood that she had been wrong to believe that compliance would save anyone. She understood that the system would devour her children one by one, would consume everything she loved, and call it economics, call it necessity, call it God's will. She understood that she had no weapons except the ones the system had given her. Access to the house, knowledge of its rhythms, and a rage so pure and complete that it had burned away everything else, leaving only a terrible clarity. Consider this: when every path leads to destruction, when mercy itself becomes impossible, what remains of morality? When the law protects monsters and criminalizes survival, where does justice reside? Hattie began to plan. She moved through the next week with careful attention, noting when the family retired, where the house servants slept, which doors were locked, and which were left open. She observed that the colonel and his sons had fallen into a routine. They would gather in the library, after supper, drink brandy, and smoke cigars until late, and then retire to their respective chambers around midnight. Martha would already be asleep by then, her door locked from the inside. The house servants slept in the quarters behind the kitchen, far enough away that they would not hear anything from the main house, unless they were specifically listening for it. On the night of August 4th, a Monday, Hattie carried Louisa to Betsy's cabin and asked her to watch the child for the night. She said that she was feeling ill and needed to rest without disturbance. Betsy had looked at her for a long moment, her old eyes searching, and then she had simply nodded and taken the baby. Hattie had kissed Louisa's forehead, inhaling the sweet smell of her skin, and then she had turned and walked back toward the main house. She had spent the afternoon gathering materials: lamp oil from the storage shed, old rags from the sewing room, kindling from the woodpile behind the kitchen. She had hidden these items in various locations around the main house, places where they would not be noticed by the family or the other servants. She moved with the invisibility that enslaved people had perfected over generations, the ability to be present and absent simultaneously, to exist in the spaces between white people's attention. That night, after the family had retired, Hattie waited in the kitchen house until she was certain that everyone was asleep. The moon was nearly full, hanging low and orange above the cotton fields, and the air was thick with humidity. She could hear cicadas singing in the darkness, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and then fell silent. She thought about Sarah, who had died before she could walk. She thought about Daniel, sold away to Mobile, his fate unknown. She thought about James, who would be taken within days and worked to death building fortifications for a war that was not his. She thought about Louisa, who would grow up to face the same horrors her mother had endured. And she thought about all the women who had come before her, all the silent suffering that had been dismissed as the natural order of things. She entered the main house through the back door, which was never locked, because the enslaved people were expected to be available at all hours. She moved through the darkened rooms like a shadow, her feet making no sound on the polished floors. She went first to the library, where she soaked rags in lamp oil and stuffed them beneath the sofa and behind the curtains. Then she went to the dining room, the parlor, the hallway at the base of the main staircase. She worked methodically, without hurry, placing her materials with care. The house, that had been both her prison and her theater of humiliation, would become her instrument of judgment. Finally, she climbed the back stairs to the second floor. The colonel's chamber was at the end of the hall, with Richard Jr.'s room adjacent to it. Thomas slept in a room on the opposite side of the hall, and William's chamber was next to his. Martha's room was in a separate wing, accessible only through a connecting hallway. Hattie paused at the colonel's door, listening to his breathing, steady and deep. She thought about all the nights he had come to her, all the words he had spoken about duty and gratitude and Christian charity. She thought about how he had taken her children, one by one, as easily as picking fruit from a tree. She went back downstairs and began lighting the fire. She started in the library, touching a match to the oil-soaked rags and watching as the flames caught, spreading quickly across the floor and up the curtains, then the parlor, then the dining room. The fire grew with terrifying speed, feeding on the expensive wood and fabric, racing up the walls and across the ceiling. The heat became intense, and smoke began to fill the house, thick and black, carrying the smell of burning varnish and scorched cotton. Hattie stood in the main hall, watching the flames spread, and she felt nothing. No regret, no satisfaction, only a kind of emptiness, as if she had already burned away along with the house. She heard shouting from upstairs, confused and panicked. The colonel's voice, calling for help. Richard Jr.'s voice, hoarse with smoke. The sound of doors slamming, feet running on the floorboards above her head. She turned and walked out of the house, through the front door, moving across the lawn toward the quarters. Behind her, the flames were visible through every window now, brilliant orange against the darkness. She could hear screaming, she could hear the house itself groaning, the sound of beams cracking and walls collapsing. She did not look back. By the time the other enslaved people emerged from their cabins, roused by the light and the noise, the main house was fully engulfed. They formed a line to the well, passing buckets of water, but it was futile. The fire was too large, too hot, too far advanced. They could only stand and watch as the symbol of their enslavement burned to the ground. Moses stood beside Hattie, his face illuminated by the flames, and he said nothing. Clara sang a hymn, her voice barely audible above the roar of the fire. Betsy held Louisa, who was crying, confused by the light and the noise. The colonel and his 3 sons perished in the fire. Their bodies were recovered the next day, charred beyond recognition, identifiable only by the locations where they were found. The colonel in his chamber, Richard Jr. in the hallway outside his room, Thomas and William in their respective chambers. Martha Thornwood survived because her wing of the house was separated from the main structure by a breezeway, and the fire did not reach it before the house servants managed to evacuate her. She was found the next morning, sitting in the garden, still in her nightdress, staring at the smoking ruins with an expression of profound relief. The investigation was brief. The sheriff from the county seat came, asked a few questions, and concluded that the fire had been accidental, likely caused by an overturned lamp in the library. No one suggested that it might have been otherwise. The idea that an enslaved woman could have committed such an act was literally unthinkable to white authorities, who understood enslaved people as passive victims or primitive brutes, but never as agents capable of calculated resistance. And the enslaved people who might have known the truth said nothing, because to speak would be to invite collective punishment. Reflect on this. How many other acts of resistance were dismissed as accidents, attributed to carelessness or divine judgment, because the alternative was too terrifying for the slave-holding class to acknowledge? How much of history has been erased simply by refusing to see? Martha Thornwood sold the plantation within a month. She returned to Charleston to live with her sister, taking with her a handful of household servants, but leaving the field workers to be sold at auction. The property was purchased by a speculator from Montgomery, who had made his fortune running supplies through the Union blockade. He renamed it Oak Grove and brought in new management. Most of the enslaved people who had lived at Thornwood were dispersed to other plantations throughout Alabama and Mississippi, families separated, communities destroyed. Hattie and her 2 children were among those sold. The records show that they were purchased by a man named Henderson, who owned a cotton plantation near Selma. There is no further documentation of Hattie's life. She disappears from the historical record, as so many enslaved people did, becoming invisible once again. We do not know when she died, or how, or whether she ever told her children what she had done on that August night in 1862. James survived the war and Reconstruction, and in 1870, he appeared on the census as a free man, working as a blacksmith in Montgomery. He had married a woman named Ruth, and they had 3 children. The census taker recorded his last name as Thornwood, though whether this was chosen by James or assigned by the enumerator is unclear. He died in 1891, and his obituary in the Montgomery Advertiser described him as a respected member of the colored community, known for his skill and his quiet dignity. Louisa's fate is less certain. There are baptismal records from a church in Mobile that mention a Louisa born in 1861 to a woman named Hattie, but the surname is illegible. If this is the same Louisa, she would have been raised in Mobile during the chaos of the war's end and the brutal years of Reconstruction. She may have survived, she may have had children of her own, or she may have been one of the countless black women who disappeared into the violence and poverty of that era, leaving no trace. The ruins of Thornwood Plantation stood for many years after the fire, a blackened skeleton visible from the road, a reminder of something that no one wanted to remember. Eventually, nature reclaimed the site. Vines grew over the fallen walls, trees sprouted through the foundations. By the early 20th century, there was little evidence that a great house had ever stood there at all. The land was parceled out and sold to small farmers, and the memory of what had happened faded into legend, then into silence. But stories like this one persist, passed down through generations, whispered in families, recorded in fragments in court documents and plantation ledgers, and the testimony of formerly enslaved people, collected by WPA interviewers in the 1930s. They persist because they are true, because they happened, because the past does not simply disappear because it is inconvenient or shameful. The fire that Hattie set on that August night was an act of desperation and rage, but it was also an act of witness. It declared, in the only language available to her, that she was not an object to be used and disposed of, but a human being pushed beyond endurance. The legacy of American slavery is not simply a matter of historical interest. It is written into the landscape, into the economic structures of our society, into the stories we tell about who we are and how we came to be. It is present in every disparity of wealth and health and education that persists along racial lines. It is present in every conversation about justice and reparations, and whose lives matter. Hattie's story is not exceptional. It is one story among thousands, among hundreds of thousands, of people who resisted in whatever ways they could, who refused to accept the degradation imposed upon them, who fought back even when fighting back meant death. The slave-holding South built monuments to its own righteousness, wrote laws to sanctify its cruelty, and preached sermons to justify its violence. But beneath all that carefully constructed mythology was a simpler truth. It was a society built on terror, maintained through brutality, and sustained by the systematic destruction of human dignity. Hattie understood this. Every enslaved person understood this. They lived inside that knowledge every day of their lives. When we tell these stories now, we are not doing so to sensationalize or to judge individuals across the chasm of time. We are doing so to remember what was, to acknowledge the suffering that made possible the wealth and power of a nation, and to reckon with the moral debt that remains unpaid. The fire that consumed Thornwood Plantation was one small flame in a much larger conflagration, the slow-burning catastrophe of slavery itself, which consumed generations and left scars that have not yet healed. These are the stories that make people uncomfortable. These are the stories that were left out of the history books, that were considered too disturbing, or too controversial, or too complex for polite conversation. But discomfort is not a reason to forget. It is a reason to remember more carefully, to look more closely, to understand more deeply. The past is not dead. It is not even past. It lives in us, in the choices we make, in the society we build, in the justice we pursue or fail to pursue. Hattie set fire to Thornwood Plantation on a summer night in 1862,
and in doing so, she wrote herself into history, not as a victim, but as someone who refused to remain silent in the face of absolute power. Her story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, but also to the terrible cost of resistance in a world where some lives are deemed worthless and some suffering is deemed acceptable. It is a story that demands to be told, not because it is comfortable, but because it is true. If this story has moved you, or challenged you, or made you think differently about the past, I encourage you to leave your thoughts in the comments below. These conversations matter, this history matters, and remembering those who have been forgotten is a small but necessary act of justice. Thank you for watching Shadows of the South, where we refuse to let the past remain buried. Until next time, may we have the courage to face history honestly, no matter how difficult that honesty may be.